Hello, this is Liam, your host for the next hour or so, I imagine. Game Production Academy. So I am here to try and help you answer some of the production questions you might have, and please feel free to ask me more and more and more. I'm sorry I've been gone for about 2 weeks since the last work estimation video, and that was because I was ill, and I've been ill, and I've been coughing my guts up, so I haven't been able to do anything. But I'm back now, very keen and enthusiastic to catch up on. I think I've got 3 questions and a whole bunch of personal topics I want to catch up on. But this one, you can see here. So I was asked a question by Javiera, who asked, "Hi Liam, I'm thinking what Indian mid-size 4 to 100 people studios can do with general documentation across the organization." And she was asking about vital instructive documentation, onboarding, even get bonus points. Yes. How to decide the cadence of when documentation is needed, who's delegated ownership, how people go about assessing what to document, etc. Now, I can't cover all of this in one go without it being about 8 hours long. But luckily, I do like to talk, so I imagine it's going to be a good hour. I have done some prep on my lovely Miro board, which I'm happy to share with you afterwards. If anybody wants it, I can just send it to you, you can export it. Just so we're clear, though, I mean, I've called this keeping documentation valid and worthwhile. So I'm going to go off-piste. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. But as usual, that's fine. So do let me know if this is useful, and I'll try and cut it up a little bit better this time so that it's not just one long block, but who knows what will happen. And I'll just finish eating my my bread, and then we'll get on with it. Now, I strongly insist that you sit down with a nice cup of tea and some toast, or maybe some coffee, because you could be here for a while. Just some background. So I wasn't always a games producer. Most of us weren't, right? We have backgrounds. I actually worked outside the games industry for many years, and one of the areas that I was interested in after studying social psychology with computing at university was e-learning. So back then it was called e-learning, which was pretty much how to collect and share knowledge, right? How to collaborate with knowledge, how to offer that online. And back then, which was, I mean, this is back in like 1750 or something, but back then we didn't have such sophisticated access to online resource. So you had to be quite coherent around hard copy documentation, and moving out of the period towards Agile, where it was working software over documentation. I learned quite a lot then about what transformed into knowledge management and knowledge sharing, and it's actually quite a large school of study and applying of theory. So. And I think this is an interesting thing about game production, because many of us, when we were in the early stages of game production, and perhaps you are now, you don't realize that there are other industries, if you will, or other areas of skill, expertise, training, etc. available, which you go, well, I wish someone had told me that. A typical example is project management. Now, I have opinions, which I will share at a later date, about project management and game production. But this is a good example of where I definitely benefited. When I started at PlayStation many years ago now, my knowledge management and e-learning specialism, my knowledge, the fact that I had been working in many different companies delivering, say, training material and writing documentation, knowing how to interview subject matter experts, knowing how to organize information, that's never left me, right? That's always something I've benefited from. And I think as a game producer, whatever your title might be, right? If you do vaguely game production, you're very welcome here. You really benefit from understanding that there are a number of very interesting areas that you can study outside of game production, which will help you. And this is one of them. So I was really happy about this question. It taps onto something that I spent years working on. However, that was a long time ago. Things have changed. I'm just going to give you a potted sort of history and a little bit of, I suppose, focus on the not just documentation but knowledge, right? Knowledge sharing and knowledge storage, etc. in a games company. So let's get going. Actually, I'll just finish some bread. Homemade sourdough, you can't beat it. Right, so let's zoom out. So you're going to go through this today. Good luck. And let's start here. So I thought to myself, well, what are some typical examples of written information? Okay, now there's a difference between information and knowledge, but let's not get too hung up on that. Let's just look at some information. And if I start, say, at the top, work down, let's start with the Agile Manifesto. So a lot of you profess to being Agile, God knows what you call yourselves, Agile producers, let's say. Agile Manifesto suggests putting working software over comprehensive documentation. So to produce documentation with information that is essential to move forward when it makes the most sense. I am not going to be spending the next period of time talking to you, focusing on, say, just the GDD, right? The game design docs. I'm not. I want to touch on lots of different kinds of documentation, information, and knowledge. But I just want to touch on the Agile Manifesto because it's often misunderstood. People often use this to say, oh, you're not supposed to do any documentation. That's not true. What the Agile Manifesto says is that you should value working software over comprehensive documentation. And there's a reason for that. Historically, the Agile Manifesto was written at a time when you have things like 20 volumes of documentation on an IBM shelf to explain how to do something with an IBM piece of hardware or software. Those days are behind us, right? But this was about, it's more important you can get your software working and you can get your software in front of people. That's way more important than sitting there writing documentation, which will be dead soon anyway. So it addresses a particular need at a particular time. What's interesting is that it still has a great deal of durability in modern terms, because now we're looking at Agile and Lean. We're looking at Lean Startup. We're looking at providing information at the last moment. Not providing information at the last moment, generating as much information as possible and making decisions at the last moment. There's a lot that's been built into this sort of philosophy, right, around the manifesto that's still quite useful. Now, we know that some documents rely on others, and we know that there's a hierarchy of needs. So, for example, with the hierarchy of needs, and we'll go back to this, we can see that without, say, a game vision, it's very difficult to write a game design document. And without a game design document, it's very difficult for, say, engineers to plan out what the framework of the game's going to be. These things come and go, and these things are very much about the scale of the company you're dealing with and the ambitions of the company. So if we look, I mean, things like even user stories and epics, right? That's information, okay? That's documentation. You write down a user story, you write down an epic, perhaps if you use such things. Phase acceptance criteria. So the more senior producers or dev directors amongst you, you'd be very familiar with how do you get through a phase, right? How do you pass from, say, pre-production to full production, or whatever your phases are? And again, this changes depending upon the scale of the company and the scale of your ambitions and how formal you are. But a lot of the larger companies have got into the habit of saying, right, well, here's the tick boxes. So for us to get, say, from vertical slice 1 to vertical slice 2, here's what we're going to have to prove. And here's the advances we're going to have to make compared to our previous vertical slice. Or to get from, say, concept into pre-production, here's what we're going to have to have proven first. And let's see how many of these tick boxes we can tick. And I don't say that flippantly. This is part of game production in that it's a chance to pull everything together and make sure it's all working, which is where you have things like the proof of concepts, and where you have stuff like in mobile, even the touch point there of getting a rapid prototype out in front of people, in front of customers, right? There's certain tick boxes you have to do, right? I mean, it's obvious that if you want to do deployment and execution, phase acceptance is vital, and you need to document that, and you need to keep it up to date, and it needs to be, like all of this, it needs to be customized towards what you actually need. So automation testing, QA have access to automation templates, and they have access to as much or as little automation testing as they're pretty much resourced and allowed to do. Automation testing is huge for us in the games industry. It should be, because it leads to a world of CI/CD. So continuous deployment is in continuous improvement is much easier when you have automation testing in place. IT partners and licenses, game tomes, outsourcing agreements. There's a lot of different kinds of information that you can be generating, and you have to be asking yourself at this point, holy crap, that's a lot. And who's going to do all of this? Who's going to write this stuff? Now, it could be that there's 3 of you and it's an indie game and you couldn't care less about any of this stuff and you're doing it all yourself. That's fine. You can move on. There's not much of this is going to apply to you. But you remember the original question was medium-sized companies, and this stuff gets generated, right? Like the last few jobs I've been in, these outsourcing agreements here, they can be huge. They can be huge in terms of quantity and huge in terms of impact if you don't get the outsourcing agreements right. So maybe you have an outsource manager, maybe you don't. Game tomes, security as well, requires documentation, just security, certain compliance, all sorts, QA test plans, technical manuals. I'm going to speed up a little bit so we're not here for the end of the world. Art Bibles and style guides, right? And technical manuals, internal scripting reference manuals. So a couple of times I've worked in places where we have people working on, say, Lua documentation, which are reference manuals to say, here's how you can use Lua scripting in our game, using, say, some middleware scripting overlay. Job descriptions as well. Nothing to do with the fact you're a games company, but in order for you to hire people, you need to write some job descriptions. And I think any hiring person here who works with a games company or in a games company will say it's often difficult to get the time from people to write these job descriptions. But if you don't write them, guess what? You can't hire. Definitions of done and acceptance criteria. So leaping back up to the job itself, the tasks, the teams, and the work that they're doing. Without definitions of done, you're doomed. Definitions of done are so important. And acceptance criteria, how are you going to accept the user story, let's say. Certain compliance I mentioned, very big if you're in mobile, right? And people often ignore certain compliance to their peril. Vision and pillars. And design documents, are kind of dependent on each other, really. Well, that's not true. Design documents are kind of dependent upon the visions and pillars, but they can influence one each other. They're fluid, right? They're fluid. They can change. Legal documentation, particularly if you're a big company, if you've incorporated, if you're international, you're going to have a lot of legal documentation. Onboarding documentation. So onboarding information that you might have in, say, an internal wiki, or you might have in a set of videos, or you might have in who knows. That stuff needs to be updated. It needs to be there. It needs to tell people what to expect culturally, but also what to expect in terms of, hey, I've just joined the art department. Where's the onboarding guide for art? What do I need to install? What do I need to know? What are the naming conventions? Where do I store things? Am I using Perforce? And blah, 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 right? This is big. This is big stuff. And if it's not there and it's not kept up to date, that's a problem. Player-facing guides, engineering bibles, system design sheets, tech feature specs, business contracts, regular external partner updates. So this one's interesting. The regular external partner updates are, say, if you're being paid by a publisher and they're expecting to see something every month, they'll expect to see documentation explaining what you've done and why, and what you haven't done and why, and what's worked and what hasn't worked, let's say. And perhaps it's accompanying a build. Maybe you've pulled everything together for a monthly build, you send it off with some documentation, and they get to read that stuff, those updates. The more senior you are, the more you're going to be involved in that. Workflow and process guidelines. So, this is pretty huge for producers, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I love the whole, you can probably notice, I love the whole sort of diagrammatically illustrating a workflow or a process and then trying to improve it and trying to look at the lean side of things when you come to saying, okay, where's the waste here? Where are we losing time the most? Where are we at most risk? What can we do about that? Right? Those guidelines there, they can't just be left in draft form. You need to finish those things. And then if you're using something like Jira, workflow and process is huge to place in there. So then risks and issues. one of the first things I ever wrote and talked about and recorded for Game Production Academy was risks and issues. Right, I've got a 3-parter out there that you can watch. God help you, and it's pretty long. But risks and issues are huge. Well, hopefully they're not huge for you, but they're huge that you actually document them and that you have a process of how to deal with them. You're not just documenting something that's dead. And you can see this with design documentation. And a lot of designers will complain about this and say, why am I being asked to document a thing which is going to be not even relevant in a month's time, right? We might not even make it, right? Why do I have to document this stuff? Same goes for risks and issues. You can say, well, what's the point of me putting down these risks and issues? We're not going to do anything with them. Well, that is where you're wrong, right? Go and have a look at my risks and issues stuff, but you need to have a proper risk process for how you deal with risks and issues. You need to have a proper process for who's going to deal with it, what the cadence is, etc., just like the question at the beginning. SLAs, service level agreements. So if you've got live ops, well, not live ops, actually, let's just say if you've got operations out there, you've got DevOps, they're going to have an IT, etc. They might have service level agreements where they've promised a certain level of uptime, certain level of response time, etc. Different teams can have this sort of stuff. You're basically committing to do something in a certain amount of time and to a certain level of quality, and maybe you've got first, second, third line. So for example, Sony PlayStation, I was leading the dev support team for a while, and our dev support team had to support developers, and we had SLAs for how quickly we would respond, and if it was an emergency or needed to be escalated, and who we were going to wake up in the middle of the night and that sort of stuff. But it all needs to be documented. At least maybe it does, right? Depends on your company. Maybe somebody else has got this for you and it's all covered, but maybe it's something that hasn't been done and it should, and it would help. Much of this should be about reducing chaos and noise, as opposed to producing documentation because you thought it was a good idea and it was missing. Like, please don't take all this list and go, oh, hang on, we don't have any SLAs, let's make some. Like, do you need them? Is it going to improve anyone's life? Right? That should be the way you ask these things. Is it going to reduce risk? Is it going to remove issues? So code comments, you can see I'm just leaping everywhere, right? This is just stuff that came off the top of my head when I was preparing this. So it's not inexhaustible. There's a lot more that could go in here. Code comments though, do you have code comments? Are your engineers going to come along and go, what the hell is this? There's no code comments. It's like, we don't know what this is and why this was written in this way. That slows people down, right? Good code comments can help keep your team going much quicker and can reduce risk and can help understanding, etc. But it involves some time. It involves committing some time to do that. And we're going to come back to that and how you get that time. Project plans, of course, right? If you're a producer, there's quite a lot of documentation that's required, which is about, well, how are we planning out what we're doing? What is it? Roadmaps are documentation. Even if you look at, say, a Jira roadmap right inside Jira, that's documentation. It's knowledge, it's information. And I don't want to get too caught up on definitions here, but obviously it being me, we will get a little caught up in it. So let's have a look at this. So we just talked about that, but there's also implicit unwritten knowledge. Now, there's documentation, right? Stuff you can write down, information you can store in some form. And maybe that's, how to get into your office, or maybe it's how to download the remote software that you need so you can all talk to each other. But maybe you want to look at this too. The stuff that's not written down, right? The sort of people that you hear about later, oh my God, I can't believe they left because we hired them because they had all this knowledge in their head and we could never get rid of them. But they've left. What are we going to do? They've taken all this knowledge away with them and we never documented it. So this is your veterans, right? Your veterans' historical knowledge. So the sort of people who've been in a company for 10 years or more, 5 years or more, these days 2 years or more, who knows? And who know a lot. And because they know it, they shortcut a lot of problems, right? It's implicit. And this implicit value that people bring is huge. So when you get rid of 10,000 people in a company, as has happened recently, bless those poor people, right, in January of 2023, and it's still happening now into February, you've lost so much knowledge. I remember when we were on PlayStation Home, back in the day, and we knew that the team wasn't going to be moving from PS3 to PS4. We had to make a choice about what to do with that team. And one of the business modes that we took up was to say, hey, you're going to lose all of this implicit, unwritten knowledge. We have a team here who's got knowledge in a whole virtual world system, microtransactions, blah, 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 et cetera, that you haven't got anywhere else in PlayStation, right? You don't want to lose that. And that was successful, right? That value that comes with the implicit knowledge, that value is there, and you can talk about it and you can shine a lamp on it. Okay, and I mentioned subject matter experts. I'm sure you know who those are in your organization. And it's extremely valuable what they know, but it's extremely risky too. Because if they go, and when I say if they go, that could be anything, right? They can move to another company, they can move to another department, they can move out of your teams, out of your influence of being able to go and talk to them, whatever, who knows, right? Life goes on. Let's embrace change. But those SMEs, those subject matter experts, once they're gone, so is all that knowledge. And so it's often poorly documented because it's in their heads, okay? And you need to think about that. You need to think, well, is there a way for me to actually bring that knowledge in and do something with it in the form of writing it down? Can somebody do that? Because it's a risk. And you, as a producer, you own a certain level of risk and issue. Okay. And even if you have to take it to, say, the engineering director or whoever it is that you've got there and say, this is a risk, can we do something? And they might say, well, no, they're never going to write that stuff down. We haven't got the time, blah, blah, blah. You have to be in a position to say, well, here's why. And again, we'll come back to that. Okay. So these are all the different kinds of information and knowledge, or some of them, right? And some of the implications and why it's interesting. And there's a lot more that you can look up there. There's a handy link on document360.com's got some good stuff on agile documentation, methodology, and best practice. You might want to have a look at. But let's just move on to this piece. So how do we manage it all? Okay, and we're going to also cover how do we prioritize, and we're going to look at some templates as well, and we're going to look at some building docs into workflow examples. So let's start with up here though. So I mentioned that you could have a small section. Sorry, I mentioned that you could have an order, right? Some docs rely on others. There's a priority. And this is one really small example. Sorry, sometimes I'm pausing to sneeze and eat. So, doc dependencies. So yeah, if we look at this small snapshot, you can see, okay, here's some different kinds of information that's required, right? And dependencies here. Now, the vision. So if you don't have the game vision and those pillars, you don't even know what the game is you're making, you're in big trouble, right? But the design documents, it's almost impossible to get anywhere near those, no matter how agile and fluid they might be, right? They need that vision. And without the design documents, it's very difficult for you to produce, say, the correct tech requirements. And the correct art Bible and style guides needs the vision and the design documents. And the tech requirements here, like the engineers often are waiting to see, well, what kind of game are you making? And can we provide that for you? Can we give you that framework? Now, again, it depends on the scale of what you're trying to do, right? And it depends on your middleware, and it depends on lots of different things. But generally, it's very difficult to have like your dev and tech roadmaps in place if you haven't got your tech requirements, your design documents, your vision, right? Even your art, Bible and style guides to an extent, right? This isn't exhaustible. This is just an example of some stuff. Decent plan for the team, right? You need a dev and tech roadmap to have a decent plan. Otherwise, you're just planning blind. If you're not really sure and you're just going for it, at some point that's going to fall over. Because when you're just starting up, all of this stuff's very fluid. And when you're just starting up, you want to get some pace together, and you just want to have a go and go for it, and that's fine. But at some point, you need to bed down and you need to say, right, what's the scale here? What's the scope? What are we doing? Have we got the right people? You need to put a proper plan together, and you need this other stuff in place. And believe me, I know, because I've seen what happens when it's not in place. But I've also seen what happens when it's too much in place. So it's a delicate balance. You need to be prepared to be fluid around this stuff in an outsourcing. So if you're an outsource manager or you're in charge of outsourcing and you're a producer and you just need to plan out, well, when are we going to need to outsource? And what kind of outsourcing plans are those going to be? And what sort of teams are we going to be employing to help us? What are they going to need to make? You really need things like, let's say it's art outsourcing. You really need an art Bible and style guide, right? You need to be able to give them a package of information. And if you don't have that ready, then the outsourcers are going to fail because you haven't empowered them properly. So this stuff's all dependent and it's also fluid. And back to the original question, right, of who does this stuff and what's the cadence, et cetera, which we'll come back to. A lot of this really is very changeable and not set in stone. And as you move through the phases of making a game, some of it does solidify quite nicely. Like the Art Bible and Style Guides, once that's nailed down, there's not going to be a huge change there. Unless you reach the point where players are playing the game, whoever those players might be, there's user testing, and it's like, oh my God, we've just realized, all right, we're going to have to change a massive piece of the art here. Not a massive piece of the art, but we're going to have to change a certain like style or golden path or whatever. We're going to have to do things a bit differently. And you might have to go back to the beginning for some of the things and start again. So again, you have to be prepared to be flexible and fluid, but you also have to insist that this stuff needs to be there because others are dependent upon it. And that's where the negotiation comes in, right? That's where you say, well, how much information do you need? I mean, I've worked in some places where the design docs had to be broken down into spreadsheets so that the engineering teams could have point-by-point checklists and information about everything. And it was way too much, and it delayed us way, way too much. On the other hand, I've worked in places where there's no documentation at all. And that doesn't work either, right? So you can think to yourself, how am I supposed to know? Well, that's just, that's just part of the job, right? You learn that and you talk to the people around you and you look at your mentors and you get some advice. So let's move on. Yeah, so how do we manage it all? It's pretty hard, yeah? Now, managing all of that isn't your responsibility, firstly. It's your responsibility to realize that it needs to be managed because someone's got to realize that and someone's got to own that and go, oh my God, we need to do this. But there's a difference between accountability and responsibility. No, a producer's not really accountable. You cannot force an engineering director or a dev director, a design director, to write their documentation. You can't force them. Well, unless you're the EP, maybe you could then. But you can't generally force them, right? You need to explain to them why they should do it. And they need to take it seriously. And most of them really do take it very seriously, but they don't have the time. So then you need to work out how we're going to do that then. So what I like to start with here, though, is knowledge sharing, okay? You will find that if you start talking about knowledge sharing, if you start talking about, hey, let's all share what we know, let's write some stuff down, or let's record some stuff, let's maybe put a little intranet together and write some stuff down there. Most people really, really like knowledge sharing. They really appreciate it. And you want to make it part of your values, right? You want to say it's part of our company values is that we share knowledge with each other. Because as soon as you do that, you give some traction to being able to measure its value and to be able to say, well, look, if it's really a company value, we actually need to do it, not just talk about it. So use the same tools. So I'm jumping around a little bit now because there's lots of thoughts, right? But use the same tools. So single source is so important here. If you don't single source, then it becomes almost impossible to make any sense of the information that there is, the volume and the wealth of the information to find everything, okay? Now, a single source of truth is so important. What is a single source of truth? Or maybe it's Confluence. Yeah, don't hate me. Maybe it's Confluence. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's... Pause to choke. Maybe it's something like, I don't know, Notion or who knows, right? It doesn't matter to me. It to whatever you're using. It could be your intranet, which is on some Microsoft god awful thing. Depends. What you often find though is that you've got people using, say, Notion, SharePoint, OneNote, Confluence, blah blah blah, and it's like impossible for anyone to make sense of it all because they have to go around all these different systems. So the first thing is use the same damn tool. Just make that happen again and again and again. When you look at the advice, that's the big one. Just use the same tools. Okay. Now maybe you need to use 2 tools because that's just life, right? That's fine. Use 2 tools, but don't use 12, right? Just get people to single source as much as possible, okay? And this will lead to versioning and scheduling plugins that you can use as well with some of these tools. Because if you look at Confluence has some really great plugins, free plugins that Atlassian developed for versioning. So you can use a versioning plugin for free in Confluence, and it will say to you, this page here in this section is in draft form and an editor needs to approve it. And the editor is this person, and you can schedule when they need to do that by. Okay, that's pretty great, isn't it? That solves a lot of problems if you're down at that level and you need to do that. The same thing is true of other systems, of course. So there's lots of plugins out there, and you just need to have a look. Just have a look for versioning and scheduling because they'll support you. Celebrate team members who share. So if you build it as part of your culture that knowledge sharing is good, then if you can get people to actually do that, maybe they're going to give some knowledge exchange sessions, right? Maybe they're going to do some lunchtime presentations which are recorded so others can have a look. Maybe you say, let's do some 20-minute sessions, right? Over there, can you tell everybody about like what's happening in this part of the game? Or can you explain this piece about the scripting that we've been doing recently and what people should know about that and what they can use, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. It's whatever it is. It's knowledge, okay? And it needs to be celebrated. So people who are those champions, those knowledge sharing champions, they need to be celebrated. And those same knowledge sharing champions tend to be the same people who will help you to keep documentation, information, knowledge up to date. So you should be the biggest champion, even if you're not accountable, okay? You should be the biggest champion to drive this stuff because, frankly, no one else has got the time to do it. And don't laugh. I know that you don't have the time either, but that's life. Because let's face it, as producers, one of the things that we do is we notice when things aren't working and we try and fix them, right? So if you can be that champion that brings other champions in, right? Spread the load. See if you can find champions, right? That's great. Regular knowledge exchange sessions. So a lot of companies already do that, but it becomes a part of the culture. They will tell that it's supported, so they'll want to do it. Mentoring and buddying. So this is huge in, say, I don't know, some coding methodologies, for example, where you buddy up with somebody and work together with them on coding, or they check your code or whatever. But just general mentoring and buddying is so useful. If you've got an apprentice, journeyman, master type system in your company, you're doing well, right? Because God knows game producers need that. The gap between junior or inexperienced producers and veterans who are now 50 is pretty big, and it's getting bigger, right? There's a gaping hole there. Other disciplines don't tend to have that because they tend to have more specialisms. And those specialists, say designers or engineers, whatever, artists, they tend to be put, a veteran tends to be put with an apprentice and they support each other. And that support can take the form of written knowledge and documentation if you want it to, right? You can insist. You can say, well, person X is giving person Y quite a lot of their time because they're more experienced. I want to see person Y write some of that down, right? Because that's gold, that stuff. Write some of it down. Reserve time during the week. So, I've worked places where we've been able to say, put Friday afternoon aside, lucky us, right? To do some stuff like sample creation, documentation catch-ups, trying out new ideas, etc. But actually having a reserve time where people can do that and measurable output, right? Like actual tasks, not just like, well, see how you feel, but here's some actual tasks that you're going to do, right? That's incredibly useful if you can get that support. And I think you need to try and do that because people are so resistant to it in that they see output over outcome, which is a product management phrase, right? It's like output, so how much are you doing, versus the outcome, so what's the quality of what you're doing and what's the impact of what you're doing. So a lot of people are all about make more features, make more stuff, whereas I'm not. I'm more about, well, what's the value of what you're doing? Do we need 30 more features, or do we actually need to address the critical information gap that we have in the company, right? Are we having more and more people coming on into the company? Are we hiring really aggressively? And we're there's 30 people coming from some company that's shut down, and bless them, and we don't have any onboarding documentation ready. It's all out of date. Well, that's a critical risk, okay? Or issue. That's a critical issue. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be fixed. Because if not, there's a huge time waste and a huge culture impact and a huge undermining of confidence in those people when they come on board. Like, well, didn't you even have any documentation ready? Weren't you even ready for us? Right. So you must say value versus risk, okay? And cost, of course. Short weekly learnings roundup. So maybe you have a show and tell every week. If so, present what you've been doing, right? Get people to say, here's a list, somebody can bring it all together and say, here's what's been produced. Here's what we've worked on. You should know that there's this, there's this, there's this. You can go and have a look at it. Some broad advice, and I know this is jumping around, but that's not surprising. There's so much to cover. But some broad advice for you, like if you're looking at this, is if there's documentation out there, any information that's recorded, get people to review it while they're working on it. So say it's a feature document. And that feature document might just be a Miro board with a bunch of diagrams and a bit of text, right? Or it might be something more text specky, I don't know. But whatever it is, if someone's working on it, on that feature, let's say, get them to work on the documentation at that point. Don't put a task in for them to review it in 5 weeks. This is huge, right? This is huge best practice advice. If you are working on a thing, update the documentation as you go, okay? And that goes for onboarding. Like if you're onboarding people into your department, let's say a design person's onboarding into a design department, review the documentation, right? Update it as you go. While you're talking to a person, go, oh, do you know what? That's wrong now. I'll just fix that. Bang, 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 done. Okay. Just do it. There's no point leaving things, like cover it while it's happening. Okay. Because that's where it's live in your head and where you're turning like a dry bit of knowledge into something that's real. Review while presenting the vision, etc., not weeks later. Again, any time that something is being presented is a great time to update it. Like if you're saying this is now out of date, update it. Again, don't wait. No one cares. No one cares if you pause and update a thing. Well, it depends, right? Depends how you do it. So removing approval barriers. Often you'll find that people will say to you, well, you're not doing that. Or my person over here is not doing that because there's so much work to do. Now, if you can build in a sense of this being valued as part of your company culture, that will help. But also, you've got to argue the case that your backlog of work that needs to be prioritized is more important than their backlog, right? That's what it comes down to. And that's why when you do prioritize that work, there needs to be a sense of urgency, okay? Because that will push through approval barriers. So what I mean by that is when you say, hey, look, we really need to update this onboarding, let's say, documentation. Let's record some more videos from staff or let's work on, say, the art documentation when it comes to version control because it's out of date now. There needs to be that sense of urgency. So you need to say, this is urgent because if we don't, this is what's going to happen. We will lose a whole bunch of work, okay? It might even be things like good old naming conventions or whatever. But you need to say, here's what's going to happen if we don't do that. And I think that's where a producer can come in and really offer some value because we're quite used to that, right? We're quite used to arguing our case. If nobody uses the information that's stored, get the hell rid of it, right? Now, most documentation systems such as Confluence or OneNote, whatever it is, they don't care if you delete it, right? They'll archive it. You can get it back. And if somebody comes along and goes, where the hell's that? And you go, don't worry, I deleted it, I can get it back. That's fine. But get rid of it. Just delete it. If it's old and no one knows why it's even there, and oh yeah, that was written back when the game was going to have this pillar and we removed it, delete it. Don't just have it there as a nice to have, for one historical day when you're sitting in your armchairs out in your veranda and you go, oh, look at that old bit of documentation. Yeah, no, lovely. No, get rid of it, delete it. You want at the least amount possible to have to maintain and look after that offers the highest impact, highest value. So schedule regular review times if you can, okay? Now, regular review times are really useful if you have stuff like technical documentation or a lot of design documentation at quite a detailed level, is that you want to be able to review it. And if you're releasing quite frequently, like if you're already live and you're releasing quite frequently, quite a lot of your documentation is probably going to need to be reviewed again as you go, right? And I think something that's really difficult is to see that when you are adding features or adding value to your game and it's live and new things are coming out, new content, if you're tweaking balance, if you're tweaking, introducing new content, etc., it's really hard to go, what the hell does that impact? Internally and externally, or what does that impact? And what should we be talking about here? Like, where is that going to need to be reviewed? But that's where you rely on the leads, because the leads know this stuff, or the subject matter experts, right? Like if you've got a system designer who's doing huge amounts of work on tweaking the system in the background, they're the person who needs to be asked, what's the documentation impact here? And it needs to be built in, okay? You need to build in that review time with them. Spread the load, see if you can find champions. We've covered this. But it's worth repeating anyway, right? Get people on side, build a little team up. It's like having the agile champion team where you're trying to solve a particular problem and you've got a bunch of champions helping you. It's the same thing here. Like, how do we spread the load? How do we make this work? Use workflows to ensure changes trigger doc reviews. So if you're using something like Jira, it's got quite a complex workflow system, which a surprisingly small amount of producers know about. But the workflow system is very powerful and can trigger messaging. Let's call it messaging. So you can say, right, when the feature development reaches this phase, then trigger QA to say, complete that test plan that you've been working on. Or when it reaches a nearly complete, trigger a doc review and whatever. But you can do all of that, right? You can have moving through a workflow triggering things, and that can be triggering creating tasks even and assigning them to people. So use that sort of stuff, right? And whatever system it is you're using, and make sure QA and support, if you've got support, use the documentation. This is huge. QA are nutters. Hello, QA, you're nutters. QA are nutcases because they are the people who know your game better than you, right? On the whole. And they also understand that if they're going to be able to properly assess the game at a minutiae level, which you demand, they need that documentation. So they will use documentation. I say the documentation, a whole raft of documentation that's that they need. So they'll be saying to you, "Oh, where's the tech spec for this?" Or, what was the approval process for this thing here? And just even looking at things like your proper feedback on bugs, etc. Right? It's like QA are used to diving in the detail. And so they will be great for looking at documentation and keeping it up to date. So like when we were looking at, say at PlayStation, when we were looking at documentation for developers, the QA team was mighty because they would use our exact, say, user guides on how to create content using our tools they would do it. They would use it. They would go through it repeatedly and they would try and break it. And they would update the documentation on our behalf. Now, obviously, that's a negotiation, right? Because you need to work out if the documentation should be updated or if you've discovered a problem, and, you have to be intelligent around it. But luckily, QA people are. They're very, very smart. So engage people like QA. If you have a support team of any kind, then they can cover updating and sense checking a lot of your documentation. Notice that I'm talking here about different phases of a game, different scale of game, different types of documentation, different types of knowledge, because that's the complexity of the situation. And therefore, you need those champions, and your champions can own some of these big rafts of information, right? You can categorize it. Now, I really want to talk about tech authors. So I was a tech author or tech writer. They're the same thing. And that meant that I wrote technical documentation. And I did that for a few years. It's very useful to have a tech writer on your team if your team goes above a certain size and is producing certain volumes of information, right? A tech writer doesn't just write tech docs. They learn and can teach others how to actually share knowledge, collaborate successfully, update information, do all the versioning and scheduling, and they can do all that for you, right? So they can create basically a backlog of documents in which they can say, we need updates on this first, this is the top priority, we need to create this document because it's missing, we're going to go and do subject matter expert brain leeching, so we're going to go and interview a subject matter expert and we're going to write down what they say. And I'll tell you what, if you actually hire a tech author to do that, a lot of the animosity that can come from subject matter experts goes away because they realize they're so important that you've actually hired somebody and that person's going to talk to them and represent what they're saying. And then they are engaged, right? You have a partnership of information sharing going on there. And of course, reviews and so on, right? A tech author can do all of that for you and they're pretty cheap, okay? Talking from experience. I've hired teams of tech authors in places, and they really do earn their cash pretty fast, because what it means is that you have people who know how to do this stuff and will do it for you. Even one person, or even one tech author, tech writer, can do all of this for you. Now, it doesn't mean to say they're going to do the whole thing by themselves. What it means is they know what the systems, the workflows, the process, and they know how to write, and they'll give you that consistent voice as well, right? So at the moment, it probably sounds like 30 different people, whatever your knowledge is, how it's shared, because it is 30 different people. But they'll give that a consistent voice, right? They'll have document style guides, they'll have nav structures, navigation structures, they'll have update schedules, etc. for that stuff, and they'll make sure they keep it up to date. So that's really, really useful. I am happy to help anybody here who thinks they need some more help on how to get a tech author in their company. But you know what? Tech authors love getting into the games industry. And I'll tell you why, because some of them are creative writers. So I've had several examples of people who have come in as a tech writer and have then moved on to become actual game writers, okay? Because that's what they do in their spare time. They just write scripts for plays or films, and then they write stuff for games, and they learn. And by getting into the games industry, they have direct exposure to how that works. Because as a game writer, you don't just write down some ideas and go, done. You have to work with, say, the design team, right? You have to work with the people in charge of design and go, well, how are you going to represent the stuff I'm writing, and what do you need me to write? And because, especially with large games, the amount of game content that you need to write is enormous, right? Imagine you're doing The Witcher and you need to write down all that dialogue, and you need to have all those flowcharts of different things that might happen, right? I mean, I remember Heavy Rain and all the different permutations. Imagine it now with the open worlds, right? And how much, You need to produce, right? These tech authors can come in and really, that's what they want to do. They want to do game writing, but you can kind of capture them in the role you need them to do as they then are learning the other role, if that happens to be what they want. And they can bring in somebody else and mentor them, right? The nice thing about it is it's at a level where if somebody is interested in it and is a good writer, so they know how to structure information and they can write down and they can format that knowledge successfully, you can really hire somebody who has no games experience at all, and they will be incredibly useful. I cannot overemphasize this, not just because I was one, but because I have successfully hired tech authors again and again, and people are blown away by how much they can just unload onto the poor person, right? So yeah, there you go. There's something to consider. Now we're going to move on to how do we prioritize, but first I will have a coughing fit in private. That's better. Right, so how do we prioritize? Let's zoom in a little bit here. Now, I mean, what is prioritization? Right, it's saying, if you think about it, prioritization is winning an argument. It's the argument of what should we do next and what order should things be done in. And it's an ongoing assessment and evaluation that is fluid because things happen, right? Shit happens and you have to deal with it. So that's the first thing. So prioritization of documentation, information, updating of content. How valuable is the information? That is your basic question, right? What's the value of it versus the cost? Okay. And that forms your backlog, right? You need a backlog. So you can ask questions like, imagine if the information on this thing that we're talking about was wrong. What's the impact? Okay, that's what the impact is. Okay. Imagine if it wasn't there at all. What would the impact be? Imagine if nobody knew anymore where it was or what it was because the person had left. What's the impact? I'll give you an example. A back-end engineering lead who hasn't documented anything and is the only person who knows, say, how a vital piece of infrastructure works at the back end of your system, right? And if they leave, no one else can even access it. Now, in that case, you'd be saying, if it was wrong, what was the impact? Pretty bad. Although, luckily, they keep it to themselves, so I guess they correct it themselves. If it was missing, well, we'd be doomed. And if nobody knew anymore, we'd be doomed. And imagine if it is accurate, what's the impact? So if it was accurate, and you know what I'm going to put in there? If it was accurate, accessible, what is the impact? And in this case, brilliant, huge, right? It reduces a load of risk on that person. If they go on holiday, for example, and if anything goes wrong with the system while they're gone, we're not going to have to phone them up, blah, 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 right? Now, you can do that for every piece of information. You can do that for onboarding. So let's say you have an introduction to the company video and it's 2 years old. And frankly, it doesn't cut it anymore. And you're saying, well, if it was wrong, well, it is wrong. What is the impact? We look like idiots. Imagine if it was missing. Well, you don't want the company intro video to be missing, do you? Because you look amateur. And if nobody knew anymore what it was, well, in that case, I'd be surprised. And if it is accurate and accessible, what's the impact? You look great. People are like, oh, that's great. That video really helped. I'm really happy that helped me because particularly with most of us being remote these days, I needed something like that. I needed that onboarding video. It really helped me. I felt like I had the baseball cap on and I was part of the tribe and it was great. Thank you. Brilliant. Right. So how valuable? Really valuable for morale, really valuable for looking professional, really valuable for really valuable for giving other people the impression correctly that you value them, right? By putting the effort in. What's the cost? So how difficult is updating the information? Who's the best place to do it? Have they got any time? Oh, look, there, your SPOF. What's that? It's your single point of failure. So a lot of people end up being this, right? Single point of failure. So they're the person who you go, oh God, they're going to be on holiday for a week. Oh no, right? That's your single point of failure. It's the person when they're not around, you're like, oh God. They're almost always the person who needs to update the information. Okay. So how do you prioritize them? Value versus cost. Okay. Now, and again, that's where tech authors come in, or the buddying up system. If you give them a buddy that they have to train up, that buddy documents the information. And believe me, from personal experience, that works great. If you can get in some tech authors, again, that works great because they can shadow, right? One thing that tech authors and buddies can do is they can build a framework of documentation and information and knowledge that's frankly wrong, but at least they can try. And then the single point of failure person, the SME, will then go, oh, no, not like that, like this, right? And that builds up that information slowly over time. And what does that give you? It gives you a backlog. That's great because backlogs can be prioritized, right? Backlogs are brilliant. So let's look at Cadence. So I was asked about Cadence. How does Cadence work? So what is Cadence? Hopefully you're aware that Cadence is, in Agile terms, say 2 weekly cadence means you do a 2 weekly sprint and you repeat all your ceremonies every 2 weeks, right, within the 2 weeks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, you get to show a working piece of software. So the cadence is a cycle time. Okay. So what should the cycle time be? So cadence, like, how does it work? So do we need a process? If so, do we need rules and owners and pressure, etc.? And if so, what's the motivation? And do we have a supportive and engaged culture? Now, this cadence is about looking at information that really does need to be updated regularly. Now, not all information does, right? But there's some where you might go, well, we should probably make sure that, say, our onboarding documentation is still up to date for the art department or from some other department, or just generally, right? The general welcoming. We should probably do that, say, once every few months. Or you might say, well, what about more high impact? Well, right now we're going through, say, a real discovery phase of the game in which a lot's changing. So as we nail down what that means in terms of the game pillars and the vision and things, maybe once a week we should be sitting down with the right people and saying, let's work through the process of like assessing if it's right, still right, what needs to be changed, etc., etc. Now, you can build in a really simple process for, say, feature spec cadence, where you say, what's the process? Okay, so every month, this person or this role, right? Let's say a team lead will assign somebody to look at a batch of information and they will just go through it on, say, a Friday afternoon, and they will make sure it's up to date. And they will leave comments, and the team lead will have to look at those comments and approve them or not. And you can go, that'll do. That's our process, right? Now, that only works if you've got the support of an engaged culture. Because if people go, well, no one cares if we update this documentation, you're arguing a great case for why they should care, but no one does above us, so screw it, we won't do it. You've lost. The people above you need to go, no, you're right, actually. That you're right, you've asked the right questions and you've shown us through prioritization, right? You've shown us how valuable that information is. And the cost, by the way, here is not just of doing it, but of not doing it, right? The cost of not doing a thing as well. So you can use this to really empower yourself and empower the team, I should say, right? You don't really want to empower yourself, but you want to empower your argument. And then time critical. So what do I mean by time critical? I mean, it's all very well having a regular cadence, but what if you need to expedite something? What about then, right? And if something's time critical, it means you just go, oh crap, that's out of date, we need to do it. And you just do it. And you just need to go and find the people and say, you're going to do this thing, and here's why. And for that, you need to have built up trust, and you need to have the right history of going to them at the right time with the right things. So you're going to be careful with expediting because people can get fed up if you keep doing it. So there you go. That's Cadence. Now, there's a lot more I could say about Cadence, and, you know, maybe I will at some other time, but it's so difficult to give some rules here because it kind of depends, right? It depends upon so many factors. So for now, let's just say keep it commonsensical. All right, let's have a pause. Okay, so let's move into this next section of templates and building docs into workflows. And then we're done. So templates. Now, I threw together some ideas for some templates at the last place, right? Because you kind of need them, don't you? So I'm going to use the design document in this case, the living design document, as some call it. So it's your visual design, your concept document, right? Outlines all the features needed by a game. Now, I stole most of this from the internet, just so you know. And I would credit it, except I've forgotten where I stole it from. So what is it? What is its purpose? Is it one document? No, it's a collection of documents. So this is just setting the description of what is a living design document, right? And then down here, I've gone like, what's the general contents that you would get? Well, the essentials. So general information, genre, target audience, game overview, history, etc. And some examples here. I'm really sorry that I can't remember where I nicked it from. I will try and put in the credit. So structure of the game design document. Okay, main character stories, gameplay, game art styles, sound effects, technical design document, platform marketing strategy. What does the technical design document include? All of these sort of things, delivery platform, game logic, game engine. Now, this is totally up to your company, your game, your scale, what you're doing, blah, 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 right? Some of this stuff might have been in place for years because you're at a company that's been using this stuff for years. You might be setting a new company up, in which case you have to create all this stuff from scratch, etc., right? Well, that could be your living design document. The point is, you don't need to document all of these things all at once. You need to pick and choose, and it depends upon how far along you are with the game. But if you were to do this stuff, what does the feature document look like? What's the feature template? So I said the feature design document is a high resolution focused on one specific feature, right? And it covers, from a hypothetical player's perspective, how the features are ideally experienced, and it says what it is and what it isn't, right? And then you've got here a breakdown. Here we go. Stolen. Bam! From Mighty Bear Games. That's good. So, feature design template, right? So it just says here some of the stuff you might want to put in. Now, I put that in because otherwise people who come into a new company don't really know what they're supposed to be writing and what format it should take. And they also don't know who's doing what. So the other thing that we did was we put in a who's involved, right? So the living design document and the feature design documents. So the exec producer, okay, what do they do? The creative director, the design director, the dev director, the design team, and what their roles are, okay? And in each of these things. So, for example, the design team create, own, and keep updated the feature design documents, but they're only consulted when it comes to the living design document. That was true in our case, right? Because we were fully remote, it was difficult otherwise, across different time zones. If you all can sit in a room together, that might change. But again, this is your RACI, right? This is your responsible, blah, 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 responsible, accountable, etc. The kind of document about who's involved and what they're doing, and if they should be consulted if required and whatever. And you can write one of these, and it can be whatever you think it should be for your team. But you can put this down for all the different documentation or knowledge, etc. Okay? But this is just an example of a template. Now, I am not going to give you billions of examples of templates because it's inappropriate and it's a waste of time. If you really want me to deep dive into a particular template, I guess I could, but it's much more likely I'll go and ask one of my friends, right, in different departments of the games industry, cross games industry, to help you out with that and to do some stuff from them. So feel free to ask. But a template's really useful if you say, here's what the document's supposed to contain and what it's for, right? What it's for and what the contents are. So here again, here's what it contains and why, and here's the template, right? And then, who's involved in it, So what they're going to be doing and why. Okay. And then it becomes very clear what their responsibilities are and are not. There's more at document360.com, how to create document workflow for business process. Document 360 is quite good. So there's this little diagram they've got about documentation lifecycle, and I really like it. So what is the documentation lifecycle? So you can plan to do something, you can create it, you can enhance it over time, you can organize it, you can manage it, you can share it, you can archive and destroy. And it's like this life cycle of stuff. Now, if you go to document360.com, it's really, and you're interested in that kind of life cycle and reading more about it, feel free. I just don't figure that most of you are that interested in this particular session. So let's move on. So building documentation into workflow. So this is an actual example of a workflow that me and my design director, mate Haluk, put together, in which we said, right, well, when should we be writing documentation? And where should we be placing, say, features in Jira as we go along? Like, how do we get Jira and documentation kind of gelling together? Okay, so we had here like the main menu feature, add a feature in Jira, add the design document issue type where it makes sense, create the main menu feature design document, right? And here, documents must add value and not be generated just because was a thing we were constantly thinking about. So if you put in a design document for a feature, you'd have this loop of reviewing the feature design, right? And then having revisions and this going around this loop. So the documentation level was at the top. And the next level down was design, engineering, etc., and where they were involved in doing the reviews. Okay. And then looking over here, it would be, okay, the play type. So prototyping and iterating, okay, play testing, and how you would use that play test to review against success criteria. And you'd eventually have a completed feature, and then you would update the feature design doc, especially references. And you'd have a feature cleanup afterwards. Now, this is quite complex, I suppose. I'm not going through it. I'm just showing you. You can do your own, right? You can do your own little process or workflow, whatever. You can do your own little workflow just to say, in our case, we need to do these things. So, create user stories and break down across disciplines, refer to a definition of done, create settings page, blah, blah, wireframing, and, for main menu. A lot of this was based around a menu rather than other features. Which is a slightly confusing thing for me to tell you now. I understand. Ignore that. So using the template or not. So that feature template I showed you, right? Should we use it? Okay, so can it be written now or do we need to prototype? Yes, it can be written now. Okay, we'll fill out the template before prototyping. No, just do a light template then with the current known definitions of done, but focus on actual prototyping to inform the document, right? So as the prototype is going on, you can update that document when you're ready. Can design happen outside of the engine, right? Well, yes. Well, design it there then. That's the prototyping. So use something like Figma because that's the prototyping with things like, say, menus. And you can do rapid prototyping, right? So level design generally expect to avoid documentation except where absolutely critical. This was an important point for us. I know this is slightly confusing and I apologize. So the situation was this, that if we didn't make these things explicit, some of the design team would feel like they had to write documents about everything. And we were saying, particularly with level design, because we were rapid prototyping, so because we were trying things out on the fly using Unreal Engine 5, we didn't want documentation to slow that down. We wanted people to get on with it. So here we say, that's fine. You don't have to document that. What you need to do is rely on an up-to-date vision that we can refer to. Okay, so the level design would be reflecting that vision because of the phase that we were in. Now, it could be like a year down the line, we'd be solidifying some of that stuff to say, here's this type of level and here's the design for it and here's why you should be doing things in this way. And so on and so forth, right? And then definitions of done as well need to embrace the expertise of the people doing the work. So a lot of the time you find that definitions of done are being created by people who haven't got a clue what they're talking about. It should be the experts who are writing those definitions of done. Okay, and they need to be written by experts because they don't need to be over explicit. They need to be, They need to give people room to explore and try things out, etc., etc. Okay, and that was true in our case of what we were working on with a new game, a new team. Okay, now you can see like there's a lot there, but to go back to the beginning, what Indian mid-sized 40 to 100 people studios can do with general documentation across the organisation. I'm hoping I've covered most of this for you now, and that this is of interest to other people too. So maybe it isn't. Maybe you want some more questions answered. Please feel free to let me know. But there's a lot of information that we as a creative team produce, and I think just to summarize, do not create things that are not needed, because it will kill you and it will really drive down morale. On the other hand, if you can find value, then you can prioritize. And if you can prioritize, you can form a backlog. If you have a backlog of work that needs to be done and you can take people through it and you can get cultural backing as well, they'll see why they should be doing a thing. And if you build process around that and it becomes obvious that you're going to need to put time aside regularly for loads of people in the team, and maybe it's half a day a week, or maybe it's half a day every 2 weeks, I don't know, then that requires the backing of the people around you, right? And to get that backing, you need to be able to prioritize, and you need to be able to show that it's not just all randomly thought through. So this stuff about how do we manage it all, I hope some of this stuff down here about the single sourcing, about making it part of your values, about spreading the load and finding champions, etc., will be useful to you. Finally, getting a tech author, so important. But not all of us are fortunate enough that we can afford one or find one, or we'll have the blessing to get one, right? And maybe you're small enough you don't need it. I would say, though, that this implicit knowledge is incredibly important to document in a lot of cases, right? A lot of people, they might not be around forever, and you need to make sure that you don't lose that knowledge. And that's not a nasty thing. It's just life. Yeah. So, best of luck, and any questions at all, let me know. I hope this wasn't too long, and really appreciate all of you tuning in and the feedback that I get over email or YouTube comments. Please do feel free to leave comments, as long as they're not too rude. And if they are rude, you can email them to me instead. That's very kind. Thank you very much.